Alright, so last week I made some milk chocolate using a wet grinder. Now a lot of you asked what would happen if I put coffee into this thing. So I decided to test exactly that and find out what happens. And actually the results were a little more interesting than I would have thought. Alright, so for those who haven't seen last week's video, let's first talk about what is this wet grinder. Well, essentially it's made of the same material as a mortar and pestle, and it rolls and crushes stuff between these stone wheels and kind of a bottom stone plate. The wheels just roll and roll and roll, and the stuff gets trapped, becoming finer and finer and finer. And one of the primary uses of this thing is to actually grind chocolate to a really small particle size, small enough to where you wouldn't even be able to taste any grittiness. Something that's actually next to impossible to do without something like one of these. Also, they're used to make delicious dosa batter. Now, side note, if you're interested in learning more about this grittiness and just kind of where the limit of that is, be sure to check out my peanut butter video, where I go into kind of the depth of when does something stop tasting gritty. All right, back to the coffee. So as I said, a lot of people wanted to know what happens when you stick coffee into one of these things. Will it turn into a paste like with chocolate? So let's just do that. So I just turned on the mill and I tossed in about 6 ounces of Arabica coffee, and I just let it go. It definitely had an amazing smell, and the coffee beans began to grind to a finer and finer powder. And I let this thing go for about 30 minutes, and the coffee I was left with was fine, but it didn't start to become oily and start becoming viscous like a cocoa nib would. So what gives? So I looked into it, and as it turns out, coffee has a very low oil percentage in comparison to chocolate. A cocoa nib can be up to about 40 to 50% cocoa butter or oil by weight. So when putting cocoa nibs along with cocoa butter into a wet grinder, it will grind up everything over the course of a few hours into a fine paste that will make a very smooth tasting chocolate bar. Now, to be frank, in the process of making chocolate, cocoa butter is technically optional, although it really helps in making the chocolate. See, when you actually crush the cocoa nibs themselves actually have oil inside. So when you roll this through this machine, it presses out the oil inside, which is actually what cocoa butter is. And essentially this is how you get that high percentage chocolate bar you can sometimes find, whereas coffee only has about 10% oil. This means there's just simply not enough oil in a coffee bean to make it form a bar like cocoa. So if we want to make this thing into a bar, which I kind of do, we're going to need to add some oil of our own to help bolster the coffee and to, kind of create that viscous coffee like we had with the chocolate before. So to do this, I'm actually going to use cocoa butter. So I heated up 3 ounces of cocoa butter until it was melted, and I just poured it into the wet grinder along with the ground coffee. The cocoa butter helped it achieve that viscosity of like the melted milk chocolate from the previous video, and I just let it run for 30 minutes and just gave a little test, and you can see here it's still pretty grainy at first. So I just decided to let it keep going. And I did take the opportunity to taste this, and this thing was pretty strong. But honestly, so is chocolate if you don't add anything else into it. So to cut down on the bitterness a little bit, I decided to add a little bit of that freeze-dried powdered milk from the last video, as well as some sugar. And I let it mill for, another 3 to 4 hours, and it started to look like this. And I mean, honestly, it's, it really does kind of look like chocolate. So I decided to pour it into a mold, and I gave it the old tappa. Then I placed it out onto the countertop and let it cool, and in the end, I got this. Now, how does it taste? Well, it's pretty strong. However, it is pretty tasty. Now, essentially, when you think about it, this is just essentially a white chocolate with coffee inside. Honestly, I don't know why this isn't it's definitely enjoyable, and it did give me a bit of a caffeine buzz, which I'm pretty happy about. Now, if you want to make this at home, maybe try adding some Turkish ground coffee, the really fine stuff, to some cocoa butter and sugar and powdered milk, and you could end up with something quite similar. All right, that's it for this video. I hope to see you guys next week for some more adventures in freeze drying. If you did enjoy this video, please consider subscribing, and I'll see you guys next week. All right, bye.